I first saw Jethro Tull in April of 1968 when they played about 200 yards from my front door, in a pub at the end of my road called the Fishmonger's Arms, situated in Wood Green, London. 1968 was an incredible time for rock music in the UK, especially if you lived in London. There were dozens of venues, pubs, clubs, polytechnics, and then there were the larger venues like the Royal Albert Hall, the Roundhouse and Alexandra Palace. So many great bands, so many great musicians. But Jethro Tull I fell in love with from the moment they came on stage. Mick Abrams was a wonderful guitarist, rooted in the blues, but he could make that guitar sing. Glenn Cornick on bass and Clyde Bunker on drums were an incredible, disciplined rhythm section. But it was Ian Anderson, clad in an old greatcoat, looking like he'd just walked in off the streets, like a tramp who just walked in off the streets. Wild-eyed, cavorting around the stage like he was some mad Sufi dancer, and as if he'd taken every drug under the sun, which we later found out wasn't the case. Even with all his manic dancing, his vocals were bang on, they were flawless, while every now and then he'd grab that silver flute and join in with the rest of the band. I'd never heard the flute being included in rock music before, but such was the force of Ian's performance and personality, it didn't seem out of place at all. Walking out of the venue that night, I had the distinct impression this was a band to watch, and they were destined for big things. Over the next few months, I saw many of Tull's gigs in London, and every time they just got better and better, tighter and more accomplished. In October 1968, Tull released their first album, This Was, and the endless touring that year paid off as it reached number 8 in the UK charts. Never did a band ever release an album with such an apt title. That was Tull, and they were soon to be moving on to new and different pastures. That brilliant non-album single Love Story was released at the end of November, and sadly it was to be Mick Abrams' last involvement with the band. The announcement that Mick had parted with Tull came out a few days later after Love Story had been released. After many auditions, Tull tried out Tony Iommi as a replacement, but he only lasted a few weeks. Tony then deciding to return to Birmingham and his old band Earth, soon to become Black Sabbath. The unknown, the completely unknown to me back then, guitarist Martin Barre was then recruited as Tull's guitarist. Martin's first gig was to be at the wonderfully named Penzance Winter Gardens in Cornwall on December the 30th, 1968. Back in those days, I had a wonderfully eccentric mate called Bill. Bill was a restless soul, always up for adventures and searching endlessly for new horizons. He had an old, decrepit transit van which he somehow drove up and down the country, up to the Lake District, or the Pennines, the Yorkshire Dales, Norfolk, the Brecon Beacons. He also loved rock music. During a heavy, very heavy, Christmas session at our local pub, the Three Jolly Butchers, he persuaded me to go with him on a lunatic, harebrained trip to Cornwall to see Tull play. Now, at 8 a.m. on the morning of December 30th, 1968, we set off. Now, I love Bill very much, and he's still a good friend after all these years. But what I didn't realise is that Bill has no sense of direction. For all his travelling, he has zero sense of direction. What he basically did was drive in a straight line from London down to the coast and then turn right. So, after a trip with many ups and downs, we finally arrived in Penzance 13 hours later at 9 p.m. Parking near the seafront, we made our way to the venue, and I'll never forget getting out of that van on the seafront of Penzance. The air was so fresh and clean. You got high just breathing it in, and all you could hear were the waves crashing on the shore. After locating the Winter Gardens, we were surprised to find that entry was free. We learned later that the place survived on take-ins at the bar, and every band that played there received a percentage of that. The place was packed, but there wasn't too much demand for alcohol. Nearly everyone was laid out on the floor on these foam cushions, and the air was a fog of dope smoke. Everyone was blitzed out of their heads. 10 p.m, no band. 11 p.m, no band. But no one seemed to care, and by that time, in that fog, neither did we. About 11:15, Jethro Tull appeared. And this is what Martin Barre said. My first gig was in Penzance at a horrible club, which I hope doesn't exist anymore. We got there ridiculously late, got into this club, and there were people all over the floor comatose. The air was thick with pot, and at the far end you could just about make out the stage. So we had to bring in the gear, climbing all over these people. Martin had bought a pirate jacket the previous day and soon had cause to regret it. It became quite apparent after the first song that the arms were way too tight, so I had a severe loss of blood in my left arm, leading to an inability to play. We only had one guy in the crew, and I called out to him, and he brought over his trusty Swiss Army knife and cut away the underside of the jacket around the armpit. This produced a lush flow of blood back into my left hand, and service was restored. I think the audience thought it was some sort of druid blood ceremony, and it was the only bit of the set they actually enjoyed. We never got asked back. But despite all of that, Tull performed to their usual high standard, and we got to hear early versions of A New Day Yesterday, Back to the Family, My Sunday Feeling, Dharma for One, and a long jam called Martin's Tune. Even back then you could hear all the wonderful things Martin Barre would bring to the band. Crunching riffs, beautiful fluid solos, and the interplay between Martin and Ian's flute was already a match made in heaven. But the band didn't seem pleased with the gig at all, and as we helped them carry their gear over the still comatose bodies, they seemed very anxious to get away. I still look back on that night, that very strange night back in Penzance, and I was proud to have attended Martin Barre's first ever gig, and a journey that would take Tull in a few short years to being one of the biggest bands in the world.